Well, hello, everyone. I'm RJ Snell, editor-in-chief of the Public Discourse, which is the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. I'm here today with Jesse Covington, professor at Westmont, Bryan McGraw, professor at Wheaton College, and Micah Watson, professor at Calvin University, all of whom work in the world of political theory and political science. Micah also happens to be a contributing editor of Public Discourse, and it serves us very well there. We're here to talk for a little bit about their soon forthcoming book. I think it's coming out in January 2025, so just a few weeks from now. I'm sure you can pre-order it, called Hopeful Realism, Evangelical Natural Law and Democratic Politics. That's from IVP Academic, coming in January 25. Hopeful Realism, Evangelical Natural Law and Democratic Politics. So, Bryan, I thought I would start with you just by asking a big picture question. What's hopeful realism? What's the argument of the book? What do we mean by hopeful realism, and what are the implications?
Well, I'll just talk now for 45 minutes as I get through things. But this is part of a kind of a longer term project that we've been involved with. I mean, for well more than a decade, where we became, I think, convinced pretty early on in our careers that evangelical politics suffered from a lack of a good sort of political theory, of a good sort of way to frame political judgments and understandings, and that we all thought that natural law could serve evangelicals well, even if historically our community had not been particularly friendly to it. And so we did a conference and an ed volume a while ago, sort of dealing with this question of whether we should engage, whether evangelicals should embrace the natural law. And then, we decided that it was, after a certain amount of time sort of bouncing ideas around, that it was time to get off the schneid and actually write our own book, articulating what we thought was a sort of defensible version of the view of the natural law, sort of out of sort of evangelical theological premises, and thinking about how to sort of put it into practice within a liberal democratic kind of pluralist liberal democratic context. So the book tries to do that. It tries to sort of show why evangelicals should embrace the idea of the natural law, articulates a theory, an evangelical friendly theory of it, puts together a framework for how to apply it politically in our kind of context. And then we have 4 case studies where we show how the theory might work in particular kind of policy areas. So yeah, and our hope is that it's for folks in the church who are looking for a way to help them sort of think through difficult and contentious political issues in a way that's faithful to their deepest theological commitments, but also recognizing their kind of where they live in a sort of a pluralist democratic order.
So tell me, Bryan, about the 4 case studies. So the book comes in 2 parts. Part 1 is foundations. Part 2 is, I can't remember if the term is applications. And that is economics, marriage, sex and family, coercion, violence and war, and then religious liberty. Those are the 4. Why those 4?
Well, I mean, in part, those are issues that I think in some degree have been sort of connected to natural arguments in the past. They are areas of study that we've, variously have had some writing on, that we're sort of interested in, some has some expertise on. They are areas that are of interest to contemporary American politics. And really the case studies aren't meant to say, this is the sort of particular precise answer that, if you buy the first half of the book, you think that's actually sort of pretty persuasive. But this is sort of where you have to land on this sort of particular thing. But rather it's sort of examples of how is this framework and how does it work, right? How do you sort of make these kind of judgments? Because one of the things that sort of we think is true is that we're always faced with making judgments about sort of conflicting goods that we're trying to pursue. And it's a challenge to understand how is it that you sort of balance out these sort of conflicting goods. And the case studies are meant to illustrate how we think our framework and our theory kind of helps guide those kind of conversations that people might have.
Interesting. Yeah. Jesse, there's a line in the book, which is kind of a throwaway line, but I particularly liked it. I agree with it. The line is that not everyone is a natural law theorist, but everyone is a natural lawyer. Right. So I take this to be a true thing. I agree with that. Right. So Not everyone will have a meta theory that they will articulate, and it looks in keeping with Jay Budd's account or John Finnis's account or what have you. But everyone is a rational agent seeking goods, seeking to deliberate about those goods, and so on. Okay. At one point in the book, I was trying to convince myself that the book was not aptly titled, and that it should have been titled "Hopeful Realism: Natural Law for Evangelicals," as if you're trying to persuade evangelicals to accept the natural law. But then throughout the book, I don't think that's the claim you want to make, or certainly that's not the only claim you want to make. It seems that you are making the case that there are evangelical distinctives which matter to a formulation of the natural law. I think chapter 2 has a subtitle like Evangelical Theory of Natural Law. So are you trying to persuade evangelicals to accept the natural law, or is there a unique distinctive that the evangelical mind brings to the natural law, or both?
Yeah, no, this is actually, I mean, this is part of the puzzling and the thinking that we've done for a number of years in thinking about the relationship between this kind of loose collection of folks who would identify as evangelicals and natural law, and kind of like how distinctive of an approach is there. And I would say there are natural law thinkers out there who would just say, what evangelicals need to do is accept natural law as it has been developed and really kind of in some really incredibly helpful ways in the Roman Catholic tradition. And in a sense, the ecclesiology and the soteriology don't come packaged with it. And so in a sense, it's a, you can just take it straight across. And I think we've come to the conclusion that there are some theological distinctives, and maybe it's a better kind of termed emphases, that inform how natural law theory is articulated and also how it's used. So both in the theory of natural law, as we articulate in chapter 2, and in the political principles that inform how we use it. And I think I want to laugh at myself a little bit. There was a point at which in this whole process where we were, instead of using the terminology hopeful realism, we were using this really clunky aspirational imperfectionism to describe what we were trying to articulate.
Yeah, I'm glad you went with hopeful realism in the title.
Yeah, thanks. Me too. And part of what I would say, especially the imperfectionism was trying to capture was, I mean, for lack of a better way of putting it, a certain Augustinian pessimism about how far you get, not just in terms of moral progress, but also in terms of, I would say, sort of epistemic access. In other words, if you've got people with different and even divergent ultimate commitments sharing political space, what are the expectations going to be for agreement on the content of the natural law, and also for how far you get in its realization? And I think that, along with the role of scripture in conversation with natural law, would be two of the places, ongoing effects of the fall and the place of scripture in conversation with it would be two places where what we're trying to offer is a distinctively evangelical approach to natural law, not just an apologetic for natural law as it exists for evangelicals. So I think you read that right.
Tell me more about the approach as opposed to the natural law itself, right? So again, not everyone is a natural law theorist. Not everyone will be an evangelical natural law theorist, but everyone is a natural lawyer. So insofar as you stress the emphases or the distinctives of the evangelical account, I mean, is there a slight risk that you are undercutting the position of natural law itself, that everyone is a natural lawyer, or that it's accessible to everyone in principle? Like, where's the fine balance between what is the account with its emphases and what is actually would make a natural lawyer like myself go, yeah, that's not the natural law anymore, that's theology?
Yeah. Well, I mean, and so a little bit, I would want to push back and just in the sense of the framing to say we are intentionally offering a theological account of the natural law. And so even in that sort of like, that's no longer natural law, that's that's theology. I'm kind of like, yeah, sure. And part of that, again, I don't want to belabor the Augustine point, but as Mike and Bryan will tell you, I'm there, you know, there's certain things I probably will bore someone to tears on. Anyway, I think that one of the things that informs the way that we approach the theory of natural law is a theological frame about the relational teleology of the human heart. That is, all of our hearts, in Augustinian sense, are pointed at something, which then affects how we use the goods or enjoy the goods, to use Augustine's distinction between use and enjoyment of earthly peace, of which we see natural law as sort of centrally located. And so in that sense, it is, I think, as you rightly discern, our approach is written as a theological approach to natural law, which is trying to capture some of those commitments that we think Augustine articulates very helpfully, but I think is also very much embedded in the way evangelicals think about ethics and political ethics.
Yeah, there's certainly, I mean, certainly a deeply Augustinian text. When you give the, not only in who you cite and refer to, when you give the four categories of goods that you're interested in: physical goods, volitional goods, rational goods, and relational goods, you have a small footnote after that where you say, and we're really interested in the volitional goods because of will and love, which is, you know, clearly such an Augustinian theme. Micah, Jesse's already brought this up, but I wanted to direct this to you. The language of antithesis that you see throughout the text. So you have, Jesse mentioned the sort of noetic effects of sin, or the limits that we might have. You know, I know that antithesis is not language that is only used by the Dutch Reformed tradition, but certainly the giants of that tradition refer to antithesis quite a bit, or at least in my own experience. Tell us about antithesis. I expect that lots of readers of natural law will not know what that is. So what is it, and why does it play such a central theme in the book?
Yeah. So I think there's a tension insofar as all human beings are made in the image of God, right? So there's a commonality there that we think is can be accessed through just our rational means, but also is there in the biblical text and in the Christian tradition, that we are all made in the image of God. At the same time, there is, and this is where the Reformed folks, everyone has this. Augustine certainly has it. Reformed folks put significant emphasis. There's the fall, and there's our fallenness, there's our sinfulness, and there is in the Christian tradition a sense of being called out, right? That we are different from those who are not believers in Christ. And when we're thinking about natural law, we're thinking about the political realm, we're thinking about sharing a community, what kind of goods that we can share that will be recognized both by Christians and by non-Christians. We have this tension of the commonality, right? We're human beings. There are human ways to flourish that everyone can see. And yet there is this antithesis. There is a be ye separate. There is a calling out. Ecclesia, the church, meaning of that is to be called out. And so I think throughout our book and throughout our thinking on this, we really wanted to have that recognized in how we go about coming to conclusions about matters that are important in the public square, and then also how we think about how we as Christians interact with each other and with our neighbors who don't have the same convictions that we do. What are the boundary lines of those commonalities? How much can we expect? How much can we? This is where the realism comes in. Jesse was mentioning earlier that we believe we're called to partner, junior partners for sure, with God to try and make things better. But we have a line, and we're in sales and God's in management, and we don't guarantee what the outcome is going to be. That's where we're modest in our expectations, and yet we're still hopeful because we believe God calls us to this. And despite the antithesis, good things can happen on the political realm. So I think that antithesis is an important theme. It also limits us. We don't think we're going to be triumphalists. We're not going to, emphasize the eschaton. We're not going to usher in this fantastic, it's always going to be a tragic aspect to our efforts and to our living in the polis in a pluralistic setting. So I think that's I guess that'd be my initial reaction, to try and just highlight the tension there between the two.
Would it be fair to say that in the book, you all don't explore with much attention? I don't mean this as a criticism. It just is not a topic that seems to emerge in the book. What I take to be fairly standard Reformed objections to natural law, namely the darkness of the intellect, noetic effects of sin. And by antithesis here, you really are emphasizing the political antithesis, city of God, city of man, and the distance or rupture between them. Is that fair? No.
Can I chime in here?
Yeah.
I don't think that's quite right. I do think that we're dealing with some of the, I would say, kind of the traditional categories on noetic effects of sin. We're using kind of an Augustinian framework for how that's described, and he uses the analogy of twilight knowledge versus daylight knowledge, and we want to say, yeah, the kind of like the consequences of sin mean there are these sort of, twilight's not darkness, it's not total darkness, it's, you can see some of the same stuff, but it's not going to be perfect, and it's not going to be perfectly shared. And I'll just say, I really think there's this danger, and we're trying to walk this line, right, where evangelicals who are deeply sensible of the dangers of antithesis, or maybe they're deeply aware of the realities of antithesis, may be tempted to absolutize antithesis to the point where they're ready to accept a kind of a Rawlsian framework for we really aren't going to agree, or we can't expect meaningful agreement on any foundational principles, and we want to kind of say, actually, like that's a darkness rather than twilight kind of approach, but it's not also going to be all daylight through the interpretive lens of Scripture that Augustine's holding out, but to say, how do we recognize some of the shareability without absolutizing the divergence?
So the reason I put it that way is it seems to me the book, we have a scriptural account of natural law, scriptural account of creation, scriptural account of the moral agency of the human. That's there. But it seems to me that your account of natural law doesn't spend a whole lot of time with the epistemology of natural law. The scripture that is there to demonstrate that we can have access to this kind of moral knowledge. But there's not a very long depiction about the epistemology of natural law. And so it seems to me that the anti-perfectionism in the text is mainly directed at politics as opposed to epistemological limits, in part because the epistemological questions of natural law just don't seem to me to be thematic in the book. And so much so that I wanted to ask why you guys were writing this way. So early on in the book, you say, hey, don't misinterpret us. We're not Christian nationalists. And in the sections on confessional pluralism, religious freedom, limits of government, it seemed to me, I'm wondering if my sense of this is correct, that you were as worried or as concerned to correct an error, which would deny religious freedom, let's say from a secular state, like a completely secularized society, as you're also worried about theonomy and integralism and so on from the other side. Like, not only don't immanentize the eschaton, but don't over-rationalize the natural law into politics. Bryan, is that fair? Am I reading this correct? Are you worried about theonomy and integralism in a analogous fashion to secularism?
I don't know whether I don't think whether we're worried about it in an analogous fashion. I think that within our own context, right? We're writing this for our own communities. Like we wrote this particularly we wanted people within the church to kind of read this and think about it. And within the church, there is a kind of I think we live in an age where certainly certain kinds of Christian nationalism, certain kinds of integralism, certain kinds of theonomy have a kind of a valence, right? I think there's a kind of a deep political disappointment with liberal democracy in some spaces, and people are sort of casting about for better alternatives, and that's one of the alternatives on offer. There is a vein, it's interesting. I don't think I'd really kind of thought about it this way before, but there is a vein certainly within evangelicalism that maybe disappointed enough with evangelical politics of the last 40 or 50 years, where they just want to say, yeah, you know what, maybe we should just kind of retreat back to our kind of privatized religion. We should sort of just kind of recapitulate the sort of the division between the world and the church that, for, some of our forebears might have embraced back in the kind of the 20s or the 30s or something like that. And we definitely sort of want to push back against that, right? We want to kind of give them a sense that, and this is maybe part of the hopeful part, that, well, no, you have something to say, you have something to offer, you have good reasons for pursuing these kind of public goods. There are genuine moral goods that we share with our fellow citizens, even if they disagree about the particulars of them, even if they deny them. That they are real, and you have a kind of you have good grounds to pursue that. We didn't dig too much into the epistemology. I think in large part, there's more work for us to do on this. I think the kind of the question of, how is it you sort of really account for not just the kind of the sort of the corruption of the intellect, but also the corruption of the will that comes along with our sinfulness. How do you kind of deal with that? There's work for us to do on that, but I think also, given who we're writing the book for, I don't know that would have gone so well, right? I mean, I think those are thorny, deep kind of theological and philosophical matters that, I think that we struggle with. And maybe that's the follow-on book, maybe the more academic one.
Well, it was interesting, looking at your citations and footnotes. I mean, here's like some inside baseball of natural law theory, right? Reading your footnotes, I'm like, all right, they're citing J. Budd. All right. Oh, now they're citing Ryan Anderson. Okay. All right. Now we've got these 4 qualities of the goods. How did we arrive at these? We get these from Scripture. Would it be fair to say that your 4 categories of the good, or the 4 kinds of the good, have primarily a scriptural defense as opposed to a merely unaided reason, or origin story of how we know those 4 kinds of goods? Is that fair?
I guess I would piggyback a little bit on what Bryan just said. I think for our audience, you asked earlier about, is this trying to persuade evangelicals about natural law, or is it laying out the theory? And we certainly had in mind our co-religious in the pews reading this and how it will hit them. And we went through this debate with ourselves. How do we need to make this more accessible? Do we need to tighten up and remember, or think, oh, here's what this or that theorist is going to say? We have to account for O'Donovan, this sort of thing. It's like, well, our co-religious in the pews are not going to care about our response to O'Donovan. At some point, we need to do that, right? That's important.
I'm writing one right now myself.
Yeah, okay, well, good. So I do think what we wanted to show was that natural law is important, and it is biblically sound. At the same time, as we say throughout the book, our non-Christian neighbors can also recognize that physical goods matter. Clean water is important, right? That when we think about the cleaning up the creek, Christians and non-Christians can agree on the environment. And even Christians and non-Christians used to agree more on matters of sexuality, right? So you're right that we did not do the kind of the architectural blueprint work of how we would ground in a non special revelation way our apprehension of those goods. I think what we're hoping for is our readers, both our co-religious and, our secular friends or non-religious ones who might pick this up, say, well, yeah, I may not be able to give you the A to Z how I get from where I live to agreeing with that good, but that it can and does happen, I think, is more what we were relying on.
We're all natural lawyers, even if not theorists of. Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
And I'll just very short follow up. Like when you're talking about those 4 goods, like the physical goods, the rational goods, the relational goods, the volitional goods, right? Even though we didn't sort of heavily footnote and defend that setup, what we had in our minds, like our conversation among ourselves, was how do we capture some pieces that have been central to the development of the natural law tradition to date, that also captures certain, I would say, kind of evangelical emphases, but in a way that's fundamentally consistent with the tradition, in a way that I would say is maybe, I want to think if this is right or not. I want to say is not explicitly scripturally derived, even if it is, it's derived in the ways that I think the natural law tradition has has derived its goods, but it is certainly scripturally informed in terms of what to do with them. But our conversation was very much about how do different strands of the natural law tradition talk about the goods, and then how do we want to express those in a way that's consistent with the evangelical tradition.
Great. Well, thanks for entertaining me on that. Let's switch subjects a little bit. In the chapter on politics, you have four main themes. The first is the common good. The second is confessional pluralism. Third is restraint and liberty. And then fourth is democracy and decentralization. In the chapter on economics, you also begin with the common good. So I'm sort of obsessed with the common good recently because it's a phrase and a term which everyone seems to be using. I can't remember where it is. I think it's Gabriel Marcel somewhere says, well, everyone's an existentialist. No, it's actually Walker Percy, I think. Everyone's an existentialist because everyone has their own definition of what that is. So it fits whatever they think it is. So, you see the common good popping up in jurisprudence, philosophy of law, economics, political theory, philosophy. Fill in the flesh for me about what the common good is. How are you approaching this? What does it mean? Because I think it's such a central category, the reemergence of which into discussion is, I think, incredibly salutary. But what is it?
I think the way we think about it is it's a state of affairs in which people have the opportunity to flourish, and that we can all flourish together, right? In the liberal order, I think that the tradition has oftentimes sort of suggested that the point of the political order is to create conditions in which individuals can flourish, right? Individuals can sort of pursue their own ends, right, as they see fit. And of course, oftentimes that means pursuing it at the expense of another, right? Or that you might be in competition. You might be in competition with each other. Classically, I think the common good sort of language was an attempt to sort of say, well, no, in fact, there must be some state of affairs in which we can all sort of pursue the right kinds of ends in the right sort of way. We all can flourish. We all can flourish together. And so we think that's a really important way, and it's well within the natural law tradition, right? As you said, I think our sense of things is that, given, again, confession, sort of like the antithesis, and given sort of like the conflicts that are inherent in kind of our sort of sinful communities, we always have to be pretty modest in terms of thinking about sort of, well, how do you actually secure the common good? And I think we sort of pursue that a little bit in the chapter on economics, where we're sort of like encouraging us to think about ways in which we might sort of nudge us toward a better state of affairs in which people actually can flourish together. But without a kind of sometimes it seems to me a rather naive sense of sort of, what we could actually expect on that account. Because the problem, of course, is you get into these questions of like, well, then how does our pursuit of the common good intersect with our sort of understanding of our own sort of particular agency, our own particular kind of vocations, and especially when we sort of disagree with one another about what those things mean. And disagree with our neighbors with that. So.
Some of the language that we also use to talk about it is, again, it's very Augustinian. We use his kind of category of earthly peace as really the groundwork for the common good. And when he's describing earthly peace, he's talking about everything from basic physical and material goods to certain types of relational and moral goods. But it's also the thing that he's talking about there being a compromise of wills about among people who fundamentally disagree on what those goods are for. But at least the way I think he describes that compromise of wills is it's a compromise of wills about the things relevant to this moral life. And so I think when we're talking about the common good, we're talking about that constellation, the compromise on which varies, but as exactly as Bryan said, it's those things that make flourishing possible that are in material, moral, and relational categories.
So it's going to be aspirational in the sense that we're dealing with flourishing and the conditions of flourishing for all, but anti-perfectionist because Cicero is wrong about the nature of the polity and Augustine is right. Fair? Say more about that. It's a great section in it's very short. It's a chapter in the text, or a paragraph or two in the text, where you say Augustine's right, Cicero is wrong on the nature of the polity. Say more about that.
No, maybe I'm happy to at least get us started. But Yeah, I mean, for those who are unfamiliar, Augustine, famously in Book 19 of City of God, sort of picks up Cicero's definition of a commonwealth, and which says, essentially, it's a group of people united by a shared sense of right, and he said, nope, no shared sense of right, because where there is no justice, there's no right, and where people don't all render to God what is due, there's no justice. So justice starts at the top and goes down. He says, nope, we'll toss that, and says instead, well, maybe we can describe a commonwealth as a community united by shared objects of love, and those shared objects of love are proximate loves for Augustine, not ultimate loves, and therefore the better the community, the better the better the loves, the better the community. The worse community, the worse the loves. And so I think we strongly agree that that kind of perfectionist vision of ultimate shared sense of justice, starting with rendering God what is due, and then everything else following. It's not only not possible because of the mixed composition of political communities of City of God and Earthly City mixed inside of time. It's also, I would say, even if you could get a political community that was only Christians, it also wouldn't obtain insofar as the ongoing effects of sin. And so we think that sort of that penultimacy of the political that puts, as you say, you use the term imperfectionism, and I like the term. The problem is sometimes that gets a little bit confused with in political theory circles, where there are folks that we would in many ways really agree with, that are saying law can't accomplish certain kinds of moral ends. That gets referred to as perfectionism, and we're sort of perfectionists in that sense of thinking that there is moral good that can happen in politics, but not in a full realization of justice inside of time.
Good. In our final minutes, I want to change topics again, not away from anti-perfectionism to what I take to be an imperfect part of the book. And here I just mean incomplete. If by perfection we mean completion. So I don't mean this as a criticism, just I wanted the next argument. So the chapter on sex, family, and marriage. You articulate that there's two basic games in town at the moment. We have a companionship model of sex and family, and we have what you term the traditional model of sex and family. The argument there seems to me quite similar to the argument that Ryan Anderson, Sharif Gurgis, and Robbie George made in What is Marriage? So first, I want to ask why you went with the traditional view of marriage as opposed to the conjugal view of marriage, which is their language. And the reason I think that is interesting is when you articulate the traditional view, you articulate the very traditional account of the unitive and procreative goods of marriage. But you also articulate that coitus is unique, coitus is different from other sexual acts. So why traditional as opposed to conjugal? It seems to me you're leaving money on the table.
I think we want our audience to read and buy the book. And
who doesn't want to read about conjugality?
I think everybody, except they don't want to be known for reading about conjugality. It's like the joke about the two Baptists in the liquor store who don't know each other. So we did wrestle with that and we have a couple footnotes, because the baggage with traditional is we don't want to necessarily say this has to go with certain understandings of traditional gender norms with women not working and things like that. So we didn't want to give that signal, but I don't. A conjugal works as well. We don't think that's wrong, but it's a word that probably needs more. People I just imagine what we would love to see different churches doing book studies with this and having a Sunday school do this. And conjugal is probably just a lot to ask.
Well, the real reason I'm asking this, which is this. The natural law has long determined that artificial contraception is illicit. And the conjugal view seems to articulate and embrace that. But why does coitus matter? Why is coitus unique if we don't have to go the full way on the conjugal view and articulate at least something about contraception?
Yeah.
Why is that not there? That's what I mean by what I take to be the imperfection or incomplete.
And that's I think that's fair. So a couple kind of punt-like answers. One is that chapter is already 13,000 words.
Come on, Micah. I'm not going to let you get away with that.
Well,
it's too long of a chapter.
It is there. We are finite beings, and chapters are finite as well.
That's the worst answer I have ever heard.
I'll give you a worse one in just a minute. I've been on other calls with you, RJ. I know you've heard worse answers on things. So there is. I actually mean that in the sense that if we're also trying to get through to an evangelical audience, contraception is going to take a lot of work, right? So we also, between the three of us, we just haven't done the, got into the nuts and bolts of figuring out what we think about that issue. I think so. I think we would recognize that it's important. We recognize that divorce is important. We recognize, so in that sense, it's a cop-out answer. We didn't have the space for it. And plus, if we were trying to get evangelicals to take natural law seriously, contraception is
not a great starting point.
It's not the entryway, right? It's like, we got to walk before we can run. And then the other thing is, we might come to a different place than our natural law forebears and our Catholic friends, in which case we're starting two fights. We're giving you guys something that you can hammer us on, and we're perhaps alienating our core audience before we can get in the door to try and, people in our churches and in Christian churches are wrestling with the idea of what should they think about polygamy these days. So we kind of wanted to, I think, set that foundation. And then, if we do follow this up, and another thing I'll say real quickly is we wanted to show how the framework could apply more so than give what we think is the every nook and cranny treatment or of an application. So a guilty as charged is my basic answer. You're right. But those are my pleas for leniency.
The nook and cranny answer is perfectly fair and just one. I really wish, here's a plea to my evangelical natural lawyer friends. I don't think that there can be a coherent articulation of the nature of sexuality and marriage. And I think we're going to get to problems of polygamy, and there won't be coherent responses on IVF. You start the book by articulating the kind of moving position about abortion in the evangelical world from the 60s, let's say, till to now. It seems to me that if there's not serious reflection on contraception, the conjugal view of marriage is going to be scattered and somewhat incoherent. And I really would urge you guys to lead that conversation, because I think it needs to happen. This is not like buying toothpaste. It's something different. And there should at least be serious reflection about it. So I hope the Nook and Cranny chapter can come from it, because I would love to see what you all do with it, because I think it's of vital importance.
I appreciate that. Go ahead, Bryan.
No, you would.
I was going to say, I appreciate that. Thank you for the exhortation. I will say something that I think that the chapter does do is it does point, even if it doesn't do that articulation, it does point to the procreative nature of marriage as institution, even if it's not getting down to the specifics on coitus. And so I think that is identifying that as a firm commitment is, in one sense, it's planting a flag that is, honestly, it's not accepted thoroughly within evangelicalism.
It ain't nothing, is it? Yeah. Bryan, you wanted in on that?
Well, and I was going to say too, as well, really, you can see this book as, on the one hand, a kind of a part of a kind of I think a renewed sense of interest among evangelicals in the natural law, and an attempt to sort of convince our fellow churchgoers that they should take these set of questions seriously. But it's also in our mind an encouragement to others of our our crowd, our fellow sort of evangelical political theorists, philosophers, theologians, to get engaged, right? Start thinking about these particular kinds of issues. And we really kind of hope to have a kind of help provoke a kind of conversation among the different tribes within kind of evangelicalism, to help us think through how to do, how to think politically and morally better than we have in certainly the past 40 or 50 years.
Well, thank you. I'm grateful to all three of you for finding time in this busy season of the year to have a conversation. To all those of you watching, I'm RJ Snell, Editor-in-Chief of the Public Discourse, the online journal, the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, and I'm with Jesse Covington, Bryan McGraw, and Micah Watson discussing their very soon-to-be-released book from IVP academic, Hopeful Realism, Evangelical Natural Law, and Democratic Politics. Thanks to the three of you for joining me. Grateful for it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us on, RJ.